Acceptance. Diversity is acceptance.
Diversity is life.
Diversity is understanding.
Diversity is priceless.
Acceptance.
All people working together.
Infinite.
Unity. Most definitely unity.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Uncomfortable Conversations That Ignite Change. This is our special edition dialogue in support of our AAPI community. My name is Joanna Deshay, and I have the great pleasure of serving as Executive Director of DLA. This dialogue series was designed as a community space where all of its members, you, could listen and learn. Each webinar is designed as a way to have difficult but meaningful, open and honest conversations that eventually become turning points and actionable items that ignite change. Our desire is for people to walk away feeling transformed and feeling like they have some additional tools that they can use to begin to ask important questions. And those important questions really get to the root of the insidious nature of racism and the inequity that we see across various systems. By having these meaningful conversations with corporate, community, and nonprofit members, we really hope to eliminate some of the racist thoughts, behaviors, and actions, and encourage all of you to be advocates for social justice. So with that in mind, let the work begin. Today's webinar is a special edition dialogue in our dialogue series. So we've had one previous this month, but we wanted to add this very important one so that all of you can really get a pulse on what's happening in our AAPI community. The theme for this dialogue is We Are Not Silent, Stories and Support of the AAPI Community. Now, before we begin, we thought this was very important to set the stage for today's conversation, because we were getting a lot of emails and messages about people wondering, are these attacks and the killings that we're seeing, are they relatively new? And I just wanted to pause for a second and give some brief historical context in terms of the treatment of our members of the AAPI and East Asian communities in the United States. So if you would just indulge me, but I would love to read just some information from you. This is a widespread misconception that the recent attacks on people of Asian American and Pacific Islander descent are somehow new. This is actually false in that the structural and historical roots of anti-Asian xenophobia goes back all the way to the 1800s, where in 1882, the US signed a federal law, and some of you know this, called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which suspended Chinese immigration for 10 years. And it also declared Chinese immigrants ineligible for naturalization. We further saw evidence that came out down the line in terms of discrimination against the community with the signing of Executive Order 9066, where from 1942 to 1945, we had 120,000 Japanese Americans incarcerated and forced into relocation in Japanese internment camps in the US. So the current surge that we're seeing in the verbal and violent attacks are microaggressions, discrimination, and racism that we have seen before. Although I want to be clear that right now it has some new elements to it, a little bit of cowardliness in terms of the attacks on the elders in our AAPI community, which is unacceptable. If you have been watching the news, you know that this year alone, there have been over 500 reported hate crimes targeted at people in the AAPI community. And this dialogue is imperative for us to really give voice to and bring awareness around the injustice that's happening. What I would like to do is remind everybody that this forum, this dialogue, is a community space. And at this time, I would like to invite Dr. Brent Scholar on to remind everybody about our community rules of engagement. Brent?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Joanna and panelists and Tram for joining us today. As you know, this is a community space, and we also just want to remind you of a few things as we go through. One, listen actively and be open to the full spectrum of perspectives. Commit to foster greater empathy. Try to relinquish the idea that you need to be right. Ask questions and seek clarification for understanding. Be respectful to the presenter and our other attendees. No one or two individuals should dominate the discussion. Approach each other with kindness and love. And as a community space, we do reserve the right to remove you from the discussion if you become disruptive. But besides that last one, let's remember all of those every day as we go through life and seek better understanding. I also want to welcome again two very special people. We have Liz and Stephanie joining us today from Equal Access Services, who are providing our American Sign Language. So we thank them and Dave Wallenhop for their continued support. And now back to you, Joanna.
Thank you so much, Brent. Greatly appreciate your continued support. He makes us all look good because, you know, a lot of us aren't technically savvy. So he's in the back end moving buttons and highlighting people. So we are ever so grateful for that, Brent. Thank you. So let me introduce you to today's moderator, the delightful and incomparable Tram Mai, who will be guiding the conversation today. And so if you've got any questions as they come up, please utilize the Q&A section. And that way you will be able to answer your questions as we move through the panel. You all met her last month in our women's panel, and she was so gracious enough to join us again this month as the moderator. Tram Mai is a seasoned news anchor and journalist with KPNX News Channel 12. She reports across all of the 12 news shows and platforms, and as a journalist, the most rewarding part of her job is really making a difference in people's lives. Tram and her family fled on the last plane out of Saigon before communism took over, and she got to take her first steps at a refugee camp in Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. Her family eventually made their way to Southern California, where she graduated from UCLA, majoring in communications with a minor in Asian American studies. From the hurricanes in Florida to the death of Senator John McCain and the historic Red for Ed teacher walkout in Arizona, Tram has covered some of the biggest news stories of our time. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm and gracious DLA welcome to Tram Mai.
Oh, Joanna, thank you for that warm, gracious welcome. And I just want to say, truly, once again, what an honor to be a part of such great company. A couple of weeks ago, when you asked me to be a panelist, I was already so honored, and now to be a part of this organization again and to lead this moderation and talk about something that's so prevalent right now in the news is just, again, we thank you for having this forum so we can speak about it. So
Sure.
Thank you. So this special DLA community dialogue will acknowledge the hurt, the pain, and the fear that many have experienced and witnessed in their AAPI communities. We will then harness that energy and focus it on change while addressing critical short and long-term strategies to transform the systemic nature of hate and oppression. Attendees will hear from local heroes, activists, and community leaders as they share their stories as well as their perspectives. Each attendee will leave today with a charge of the one thing that they can do now to become agents of change. So we would like to start by introducing our panelists right now. Our first panelist is Jason C. Wong. He is board chairman of the Asian Corporate and Entrepreneur Leaders, also known as Excel. Jason was born and raised in Hong Kong. He came to the US at an early age. As a founder of Excel, Jason leads this organization toward becoming the premier professional organization for Asian Americans right here in the Valley. He aims to create stronger brand recognition for Excel in the US through opportunities for increased professional and leadership development, cultural awareness, mentorship, and community participation. Jason currently serves on the board of trustees of the Vitalis Health Foundation, is a graduate of the Valley Leadership Institute and Scottsdale Leadership Corps program, and he is also a member of the Maricopa Community College's Chancellor's Community Advisory Council. Thank you so much, Jason, for being here. Our next panelist is Lizzie Kim. She is Chief Legal Officer of the Fox Restaurant Group. Now, Lizzie Kim is a lawyer who works in business and politics. She's currently the Chief Legal Officer of Fox Restaurant Concepts, one of the most fun places to work. She was General Counsel to Arizona Governor Janet Napolitano and served in the Obama administration, working on national security and national disaster response. Lizzie was born in Seoul, South Korea, but grew up right here in the Valley where her parents have lived for nearly 40 years. Lizzie, welcome. Our next panelist is Laura Lee, Administrative Director of Diversity and Inclusion for Mayo Clinic. Laura Lee has over 20 years of experience in leadership positions with responsibilities for the development and implementation of diversity, inclusion, and cultural competence initiatives within both education and healthcare institutions. Currently, the Administrative Director over Diversity and Inclusion at Mayo Clinic, he has a vision of achieving diversity, inclusion, and cultural competence with a sense of common purpose and shared values. Laura is a strong advocate and compassionate mentor who demonstrates a willingness to spend time in support of issues of diversity and inclusion by providing strong, creative, energetic leadership in the development and implementation of initiatives that are tied to the overall business goals of the organization. Laura, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us. And finally, our last panelist is Jennifer Chow. She is founder and director of the Arizona Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders for Equity. Jennifer Chow was born in downtown Los Angeles, Chinatown, and currently resides in Tempe, Arizona. Being born to and raised by Chinese immigrant parents has a profound impact on her interests and her work today. For the past decade, she's been involved in and worked with organizations focused on serving the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders, or AANHPI, community and youth leadership. Most recently, Jennifer is the founder and director for the Arizona AANHPI for Equity and Arizona AANHPI Advocates. In the 2020 elections, the two organizations used a multi-pronged voter outreach approach that actually helped increase Arizona AANHPI voter turnout by 117% from the 2016 vote. As a new mom, she is motivated by her work to ensure that civil liberty and women's rights are preserved for the future of her daughter. Again, thank you all so much for being with us. We so appreciate your time and your concern in this very important issue. All right, so we would like to begin with a poll question to give to our 200 plus attendees on today's webinar a chance to participate. And our first poll question is basically centered around how you are feeling. So here it is. We want to know, how are you feeling about the racial attacks on the Asian American and Pacific Island communities? Are you A, disheartened, B, overwhelmed, C, confused, or D, angry? We're going to give you guys a moment to please weigh in on this. But in the meantime, as our attendees are picking how they feel, Very quickly, just around to our panelists. Jason, I just want to get a feel of how you are feeling about this. Disheartened, overwhelmed, confused, or angry?
It actually feels sad. Feels sad that as an American, always being treated like when there's as a scapegoat just because something happened. And I love this country. This is where I belong, and I should be treated just like everybody else.
Absolutely. Lizzie, how do you feel? Disheartened, overwhelmed, confused, or angry?
Oh, Tram, I am emotionally exhausted, and I think so many people are, but overwhelmingly angry.
Yeah. Laura, how about you? Disheartened, overwhelmed, confused, or angry?
If I had to only choose from those four, I would say disheartened. I mean, I'm right there with Lizzie and Jason. Like, there's sadness, a sense of sadness, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later too. But doing the work that I do, right, for 20 years, this past year has been probably one of the toughest.
Yeah, absolutely. Jennifer, finally, how about you? Disheartened, overwhelmed, confused, or angry?
I would say disheartened because I know people personally that have been impacted by the recent wave of attacks, and I have elderly grandparents and parents that I fear for their lives sometimes. So I think disheartened is probably like the best way to describe how I feel.
Absolutely. Especially when you see the attacks on the elderly, it just rips your heart. All right, Brent, do we have results of how people are feeling?
We do, Tram, and we'll be sharing these right now on the screen for everybody.
Wow. Okay, so it looks like 58% of people, which is the majority, feel disheartened, 5% feel overwhelmed, 7% feel confused, and 31% feel angry. So let's talk more about this. And we're going to dive into the angle of confronting the trauma. So the first question I want to ask each one of our panelists: can you share your personal feelings and perspective on the spike of the verbal abuse, violent physical attacks, and killings that are happening in the AAPI community across the country? Jason, let's start with you.
I think that I personally have experienced verbal abuse when I was when I was first moved here in early age, and I never really get by watching all this violence, physical attack. The way to look at it is, when is it going to end, and when is it going to be able to look at us as equal? And we contribute to our community. We love this place, and we do everything we can to making sure that this is a great country. That's why we are here for. But and I know that many of the community members just feel like, some of them feel shocked, and many of them are feel that afraid to have their family member walking down the street. And this one thing that I would say is, we all need to kind of take a step forward to reach to each other. And I know the Asian community is really looking forward to have this dialogue, not just only today, all of us here, but many more dialogue moving forward to kind of bridge that gap, because this gap has been there for so long, and this is the time to fix it.
Mm-hmm. Lizzie, how do you feel? Have you been affected personally?
Well, Tram, let me start by saying that I was taught from childhood not to talk about the negative aspects of living in America with this face. That's the shitty things that people say about my parents who speak with an accent. This strange assumption that you'll understand that as an Asian woman, I'm supposed to be both shyly submissive yet sexually adept. The well-meaning compliment that I speak English so well that reminds me that I'm not immediately thought of as an American, but as something foreign, something other. I think all of us are taught not to complain We're taught to just shake it off and just keep moving forward. And for me, I'm only speaking about this today now, because as it seems like every 20 years or so in America, those taunts have turned to violence. And so for the last year in America, the very worst kind of people have been targeting and hunting down people who look like this panel. I mean, my family has lived here in the Valley for 40 years, but last year, for the first time, my brother and I begged our parents to stop going out on their evening walks, where they might be alone and thus an easy target. The fact is, there are frightened, angry people out there who are blaming people who look like us for COVID. And it started with the very empty Chinese restaurants and the verbal harassments, and then elderly Asian Americans being pushed down in the streets in the middle of the day. Sometimes they were punched in the face, resulting in the loss of an eye. All of this while some of our elected officials, including some members, sadly, of our Arizona congressional delegation and some city councilmen, were fanning the flames, calling this coronavirus the Chinese virus and Kung flu. And all I could think at the time was, because my parents are in their late 70s and early 80s, one good push is all it would take to break a hip, crack a skull. We all know what happens after that. And I tell people this now because this is an uncomfortable conversation that Asian American children were having with their parents all across the country, all year long. My friends and I would talk about this all the time. And then in February, when a Phoenix Filipino grandfather was randomly punched in the head and pushed to the ground here in central Phoenix while he was taking his daily morning walk, he died of a head injury. And after that followed the shooting of 6 poor women in Atlanta who looked just like me. And now more random attacks on the elderly as they're being beat up, pushed, stomped on. I mean, how do we all feel? I mean, we feel angry. I mean, emotionally exhausted and angry.
Wow, that was so true and so powerful. And you hit on something that I think, we've all, as Asians, can relate to, in the sense that, growing up, we've all been taught to just work hard. Don't complain, just work harder. It's almost like, don't even stand up for yourself, just work harder. And I think, for it, and it lends itself to that very kind of submissive, dismissive feeling that, it's just, we are kind of like the silent minority, right? And so it just makes us, I feel like, more vulnerable. And, and right now with the climate that we're in, I mean, just easily attacked. And it's sad, it's heartbreaking, it's frustrating, it's all of the above, really, but it's appalling. It's appalling. Laura, I'd like to get your view on this.
Sure.
Any personal feelings?
So like I said earlier, right, been leading diversity, equity, inclusion work for nearly 20 years. And the last year has been probably the most hardest year I've ever faced. Both, you see the COVID and the impact COVID has on healthcare, and disproportionately against BIPOC individuals. But even in Minnesota, we just saw a new news release report from the state that looked at the disproportionate impact COVID has on Hmong communities. And I am Hmong, right? And so the impact it has on there. And now coupled that, Lizzie, you talked about the, Kung flu and whatnot. And then, so COVID hit, the targeting Asian Americans increased. You've got then George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, right? And the nation, the world focused on racism work, but then now you get this coming back around of increased Asian hate crimes. And although my work is trying to build both inside of Mayo Clinic and outside, 70,000 employees who can then go out and change the culture of both Mayo inside and outside of Mayo, I step out outside of work, I step out and I think, is this really impacting it, or am I creating change? And because I'll tell you that folks who know me, I've told them many times, I'm an avid hunter. And in Minnesota, what that means is stand hunting for deer, stand hunting for turkey, right? But the last 2 years, I have not stepped foot out into the woods, because when I go out there, I know it's just me and my bow. I do not want to put myself in a situation where we saw Chai Vang in Wisconsin several years ago, right? And so even having to change my hobbies just to stay safe and just to not put myself in those situations. But to Lisa's point about the attacks on, it's not just attacks on elderly. Just last week, we saw in Maple Grove, Minnesota, attack on a young boy in Sky Zone. And Sky Zone management did nothing about it. And the police did nothing about it. And so, Lisa, your point about the attacks are increasing, and I think it's always been there, but I think now mainstream America is really paying attention to it. And I think that's one of the, I guess, positives out of this, if you will.
Yeah, it's shine a spotlight. Jennifer, how about you? How has this affected you?
It's affected me in a way where it's actually happened to a lot of happened to a close friend of mine's, and it's really close to home because I'm going to give you an example. One of my close friends, and she's older, or her husband's older, in the 60s. They were walking their dog in their neighborhood, and someone with an axe hurled racial slurs and was about to attack him. Good thing he was in a bike. So he was able to escape, but that person was looking for my friend's husband again. But luckily they weren't harmed in it or anything, but that incident happened 1.5 miles away from my parents' home. And that to me was, and my friend was like, she just couldn't believe that could happen to her and her family. And that area is predominantly, it's I would say 40% AAPI. It's in Southern California. So a week after that, elderly Asian American was waiting in the bus stop. And this was 1.5 miles away from another side of town where my parents live. And he was just attacked. He just asked the person, just how are you? Like a really normal conversation. And so, and after that, I pleaded, like Lizzie, I pleaded with my dad because they always do their routine walk around the neighborhood. A lot of, I would say Asian elderly folks, that's what they do is every morning or afternoon, evening, they just do their routine walks. And I told my dad, I was like, I really don't want you to do this because there's a lot of attacks happening literally 1 mile away from you. But I don't know, it's just for sometimes my dad would just it's not going to happen to me, or it's not real. And so I don't want it to be one of those incidents where it's you have to wait until it happens before, I just don't want that to happen. And it's better to be safe to not go out, kind of thing. So that's just something that it's just really close. It hits close to home, and that's just really scary to me. And then we just recently, for the organization that for the advocate side, we recently did a community needs survey, and we did touch on some of the statistics prior to COVID. How often did you worry about being discriminated against based on your race? And we had about 1,100 people complete the survey throughout the state of Arizona. We wanted to get the perspective in Arizona versus you hear it from all the major cities, New York, California, and all that. So for that question, 46%. So it's a scale 1 to 5. How often do you worry about your race being discriminated pre-COVID? And it's 52% was at 1 to 2, which is not too worried. 3 was at 28%, and then I think about the rest, the third, 4 to 5 being like worried, super worried, is at 32%. And then we asked the question, follow-up question, like, how do you feel after COVID? How do you feel like you're going to be discriminated based on being AAPI? So, I mean, if I just look at being 4 and 5 being worried, it spiked up to 63%. Like 4 and 5, that's how it shifted a lot after COVID, because now they see what's happening in their communities, and they're fearing for their family's safety. So it's really disheartening to see like how people are feeling. And then we also have like a question: did you report, if you did get discriminated, did you report it? And 200 people said that they did not report it. And we did ask why. And there was some of them, I would say a lot of it's based on our culture, because they said that they don't want to stir up anything. Another person who, for example, got vandalized, they're like, I fear that if I do report it, I'm going to get attacked more. So these are some of these things are cultural, where they just, even though they're being harmed, like they just don't want to report it based on like the cultural norm of just not saying anything, not stirring the pot and stuff like that. So I just want to see if there's like ways for us to change that narrative. But there are, in our survey, we asked if you're willing to share your story, and there's 30 people that said they wanted to share it. And I think it's important for us to let people know that our community in Arizona, AAPI, do face discrimination, and these are their stories. So this is something that we're going to be highlighting or sharing, hopefully within the next couple of weeks.
We're looking forward to that. So speaking of which, let's take that next step. What important lessons can we unpack and learn from the tragedies that we've seen in the recent surge of incidents aimed at the AAPI communities across the nation? Lizzie, what do you think? What can we learn?
Sorry about that. I was having a little trouble, technical trouble there. I really struggle with this question. What have we learned? I can tell you that as a member of the Asian American community here in Arizona, my family and I, we've lived here a long time. The most shocking thing is to find out that all these assumptions about how safe our community is were just untrue. That's been the hardest part of this. Jennifer expressed it well. We have all asked our families and ourselves to change our behavior. Our lives have changed in different ways, some more dramatic than others. I live with a lot of privilege on that. But we've all had to change our lives in the way we live a little differently, because some assumptions we made were just not right.
Mm-hmm. Laura, what do you think? What important lessons can we take from this?
I think part of it is we've got to stop comparing degrees of racism, right? That for Asian Americans, the racism you face is not as bad as fill in the blank. Because you, as a minority, you have been on the good side of the white folks in the community. And so a little bit of discrimination shouldn't be too bad for your community. I think we've got to stop comparing the degrees of racism and be able to collectively work together to address racism as a whole, as someone in the chat was saying, because it is going to take all of us and every single community working together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Jason, what about you?
I think one of the things that we definitely learn about this is all this hate toward us because someone said this is a virus that is is caused by Asian people. Then suddenly this kind of things happen. That means that there's a lot of people don't know about Asian American. That also mean that we as the Asian American may not do enough to reach out to the other side to let them know more about us. And it should not be just, someone go on Twitter and say, well, it's a Kung flu, then, suddenly that all the Asian Americans should be the target subject. And what do we have to do as a community? I can always ask other people to do something, but more importantly, I always like to ask what Asian Americans should do. And we need to do more. We need to be more committed to reach out. We need to be more committed to do things that we are not comfortable to do. Being on the panel, or maybe pushing more Asian American study program, so that people can be more educated about our culture. And or maybe, if you are at work and be part of your employee resource group, there are always the different, culture, resource group that you can be part of. Join organization and just do many different things that to bridge that, communication and also the misconception that we are receiving. That's my biggest take. And we also need to not to be silent. And so I think was that Lizzie was talking about, it's about working hard, and it's about our culture is about working hard. It's not too much about expressing ourselves or maybe speaking up. That need to change. We are in America, we're in the 21st century. This is the things that is so important. People hear you, they recognize you, and then that is the most important step. And I think that we need to do more.
Yes, absolutely. Speaking up, that's huge. And Jennifer, finally, how about you? What lessons can we take from this?
I would say just maybe educating more about our community members, like even non-AAPIs, like the histories of the Asian American community, like the histories in terms of like discrimination, or just like all the stuff that they have done throughout the 1800s to present, like, because I think sometimes that's left out in our history books, and people just don't know what we have done, what we have contributed in the American society. And so in my organization, we're in May is AAPI Heritage Month. We're going to highlight every day. We're going to post something about for example, Chinese laborers in the 1800s built the transcontinental railroad. Like, that's like an example, just like a really, tidbit history. But, I think it's important for people to learn these type of things. And also, another thing that our org is heavily concentrated on is youth organizing. So last year we had a 22 cohort of high school and college students, and we trained them on voting rights, civic engagement, activism. But one of the new component that I added to this trainings was unpacking your biases, colorism, knowing your social location and cultural location. So those three trainings after the graduation, our fellows said that those three was the most impactful, because it made them think, because the unpacking your biases one is a pretty intense training. And I think that it's something that I would like, it's not just for youth, it's definitely for everybody. But they were saying that it made them really vulnerable to think, like, the questions that we prompt is, for example, is like, think about what would you think the thing that pops up if this question is prompt, what's the gender, ethnicity, and gender, ethnicity, and even age, or something like that. So when we say, like, what's the first thing you think of when you think of a prisoner? What's the ethnicity, gender, and stuff like that? So we had all these questions, and it just made them really think. Like, when we even shared it, they were like, wow, like, why do we think that? Like, why do we think a prisoner is X, Y, and Z? Why do we think a nurse is this X, Y, and Z? Why do we think doctor is X, Y, and Z? So that was a really impactful training. And I think that this is something that I think we could just do this for the community at large, because unpacking your biases is key to a lot of the things that, you know, is happening in our world, and be a little bit more kinder, is what I think this workshop can do. And the fact that our youth said that it was like a most important thing, it's something to think about to do in the future.
Okay, I love that you're getting involved with the youth, because really that's where it starts, right? Right now, I want to get into our second poll question. And that is, how comfortable are you talking about race and racial incidents? Are you A, very comfortable, B, somewhat comfortable, C, uncomfortable, or D, do you avoid this conversation at all costs? So very quickly, just let me know, out of those four options, Jason, what do you think? Are you very comfortable, somewhat comfortable, uncomfortable, or do you avoid it at all costs?
I'm very comfortable, and I'm very proud of who I am and my culture. And yeah, so it's something that definitely very comfortable to do.
Yeah. Lizzie, what about you?
I think I'm pretty comfortable talking about this, but I do have to say, I find myself not starting the conversation, but waiting. I don't want to lead. I find myself not leading with it, but very comfortable if someone else has a curiosity, if someone opens the door. And of course, amongst all of my friends who are Asian American, we laugh and talk about these experiences all the time.
Of course, there's a comfort factor in there. Laura, what about you? Are you very comfortable, somewhat comfortable, uncomfortable, or do you avoid it?
Very comfortable, and not only talking amongst our colleagues, but I think it's also because of the work I do, right? So constantly pushing the conversation around race and racism, even with our executives at Mayo Clinic. And how do we voice our concerns? What position do we take as an enterprise? What's the actions we can take as an enterprise? So certainly very comfortable.
Yeah, you have to actively engage. That's what you do. Okay, Jennifer, how about you?
I'd say I'm pretty comfortable, and not only talking about, you know, the Asian American community, it's talking about having that tough conversation about anti-Blackness in our community. That's something that I think that's why I created the Unpacking Our Biases workshop, is to, how do we, you know, even train people to talk about that issue, and having those prompts to have that conversation. So, I mean, I think for me, it's really hard. I'm not going to say it's easy. It's probably one of the toughest things to talk about, but I think it's really crucial, especially in our community.
But that's good that everybody, obviously all the panelists, they feel comfortable about it, because it's so important to have that dialogue. So Brent, let's see how our attendees are voting.
Trim, could I ask you if we could go back to Jennifer at one point so she could explain what she means? I think there may be people who don't understand what she means by the anti-Black issue. It's not what I think people think it means.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's a good point. So for example, the reason why there's a topic that happened, I would say 6 years ago, Peter Liang, the New York rookie officer, he was the first to be charged with killing a Black man at I forgot what, it was in New York. So when I was working at a civil rights advocacy group, we just had to there was a lot of Asian Americans. There was just two sides. So one side was like, that scapegoating, why is he the first person in 10 years to be tried, versus there's, you know, other organization was like, you know, we have to have like accountability, like we can't have, there's that two sides of the spectrum, and just having that conversation of anti-Blackness, meaning, I think the conversation was more towards, I'm gonna give you an example. That was the framework of why I started that workshop. But even in my own family, there's anti-Blackness in my like microaggressions, meaning my parents always told me like, and grandparents, do not date a Black, person. And stuff like that I grew up with that. And then I know other communities, Asian communities, have like similar situations where that's just anti-Blackness. That's like an example of the anti-Blackness, conversation or upbringing that they would have. And it's just, when I grew up, and it's kind of like, how do we have that conversation? It's like, no, why are you saying that? Like, why can't I date a Black person? Or in that situation with Peter Liang, it's like, why do we have to say that, the Asian American, just because he's Asian, he shouldn't be prosecuted for killing a Black man? And it was a really tough conversation, I gotta admit, in that situation. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you. One thing I do want to make sure that we get out on the table, though, is that there is a myth going on right now that the people who are the aggressors on these attacks on the Asian elderly are Black men, and that is statistically not anymore. That is just not true. That is statistically just irrelevant. It is people of all different races. It does tend to be men, but it has no racial background of significance. It's just, I think there are some people who are purporting to push that in the media, and I would like to make sure we all know that that is just not true.
Right. Okay, so can we see that poll question really quick, Brent? I just want to make sure.
We certainly can, Tram. Here you go. Here's our result.
So 35% of you feel very comfortable. A majority, though, 49% of you feel somewhat comfortable. 15% of you feel uncomfortable. And just 1% feel that you want to avoid it at all costs. So that's interesting that, the majority feel somewhat uncomfortable. Let's get into the impact on our community. I'd like for each of our panelists to share your experience about the perception of invisibility of the AAPI community and the notion of not being seen, heard, or often dismissed. We kind of touched on this at the top of our discussion, but Laura, let's start with you. Talk about that perception of invisibility.
I don't think it's just a perception. I think it's sometimes, in K-12, I've talked about the power of the people who have the power to write the history, right? So being Hmong, my people fought for the ideals and the values of America, the United States, well before we even stepped foot on these lands, right? But I remember growing up in 10th grade civics, and when we talked about the Vietnam War, not a single mention of my people's involvement, of the ways in which they have saved down pilots and were essentially the guerrilla war troops on the ground defending American troops, and so it's not perception, it is intentional sometimes, right? So I think Jennifer mentioned, the making sure that our history, our engagement, our contribution to this country is always highlighted. It's been intentionally left out in many cases. And so I think, so that history has led to this current state of not knowing who Asian Americans are. And by the way, blending all of us together. We all look the same.
Yeah, exactly. Jennifer, what about you?
I would say, growing up in Chinatown, I see my face a lot. So just like growing up, I felt like, I belong in a certain area because I see everybody that looks like me. But when I was 5, I moved to East LA, I was probably one of the few Asian Americans growing up. So it was predominantly Latinx and white. So I would say I had a really massive identity crisis. So when all my friends that I go visit, they would have, which are not Asians, I was just fascinated by like, what is this hugging and kissing and how are you doing, daughter? Like, that's never happened to me. So, and then when I watch TV and movies, I see no one like me. So I always think that this is like a cultural norm, like being Americanized is like the norm. And I yearn for that. And my parents was just opposite. They didn't speak English. They never hugged and kissed, never asked how I was doing. So I just always, and I fought with a lot with my parents growing up. Like, I would say I was a rebel, but before I would always use the word, oh, I was rebellious back then. But when I look back, I think I just came in with the epiphany just recently that I fought with my parents a lot, not only because of the language barrier, because I wanted to be more Americanized. And my parents were definitely not that. And I would resent that. And it only took when I went to college, when I started learning more about Asian American studies, because growing up K-12, there was zero Asian American anything in our history books or anything. So I think in college, that's when I really had a appreciation of my Asian identity. And when in my humanities class, I would be so like, I would ask my professor once, I was like, why didn't my parents learn English? Like, why didn't they get a better job? Because they just worked as a seamstress for all their lives. And my dad was a cook and a construction worker their whole life. I was like, I don't get why they couldn't do more or something like that. And then my professor was like, they got to America with barely anything. That's all they need. It's up to you to do what you got to do in order to succeed. So I think after that conversation, moving forward, I had a better relationship with my parents, and I just felt that resentment went away. And the more I learned about Asian American studies, it's like, wow, like there's that appreciation. I felt like my identity was back to normal after college. And I feel like that's why it's so important to have those Asian American studies at a young age, like kindergarten. We should learn more about our histories, or else it's gonna fracture the family. I don't know. I just really hate the fact that I did that to my parents and grandparents.
Yeah. And you know what, Jennifer? I mean, I think we walk the same walk, and I think so many other Asians out there who grew up in predominantly white neighborhoods. I totally, you brought up so many things that I could totally relate to. I mean, just very quickly, you know, I went through that whole, they call it a banana when you're a banana, right? You're yellow on the outside, white on the inside, and you're so whitewashed, so Americanized. And it wasn't until I went to college that I did a total 180 and got my minor in Asian American studies. I was so passionate, belonged to the Asian American Association clubs, and just, you know, discovered the identity that I had so pushed, you know, away for so long. And, you know, yes, the battles with my parents and all of that. I think that is so common that a lot of people outside our community don't realize, but it's just made us, you know, a better person and learn and appreciate all the things that our parents did for us. And they do it out of love. They may not show and be affectionate as we would like them to, but, you know, they would argue, you know what, I put the roof over our heads. We put food on the table. That's how I love you. I put you through college. That's how I love you. You know, it's tough love. That's what it is.
That's exactly it. Thank you.
Exactly. I hear you, sister. Jason, what about you? What do you think about this whole invisibility?
You know, when I first moved to US, I actually went to school at several places, high school for like 4 different places. But I remember when I was in Connecticut, I, you know, being a new immigrant, my English wasn't that well. So I'm always being invisible, obviously, because I'm the quiet one. And when there's when the teacher in the classroom have questions, they will kind of bypass me. But then my classmate would be pretty much the same, you know, until when there is something that they need to make fun of about an Asian person, then they will recognize that I'm in the room, and it was that kind of attention was that's always kind of during my high school year, getting a lot until I got to went to college, and that's when the time that I realized that I actually, as being an Asian American, there's a term for it, and I have my own identity. I can be more visible, and I was working with the student and try to push for the Asian American Student Center at the U of A at the time. And the administration, the answer is they could give the center to African American student, the Native American student, or even the Hispanic student, because they have a low retention rate, and they have also have a low recruiting rate as far as enrolling to college. As for Asian American, I remember the president of the university said, "You guys are fine. I mean, you guys have high retention rate. You guys have good, recruiting rate. Therefore, you don't really need the Asian American Student Center to deal with your discrimination or being invisible, because you guys are doing fine." And at that point, I realized that the whole model minority is actually holding against us rather than benefit us, because after I get out from school, college, and now you can always hear on the news that Asian Americans have the highest buying power, Asian Americans have the more spendable income. That doesn't really help us, because we still have a lot of issues more than just about job or income, and we being invisible because of that whole model minority stigma that is putting on us. And I think, we have a long journey, and, I've been getting involved with the community almost 30 years, and I see that there is a change, but if we can expedite it, that's even better. My parents' generation probably would prefer to be invisible, because they come from, they came to this country, start from scratch, and they feel like being invisible is better to be at the center of attention when they probably will be overwhelmed. But for us, many of us, my kids, born and raised here, we don't think that way anymore. We want to be part of it, and we don't want to be invisible. We want to be seen. We want to be heard. We would do everything we can to reach out, and even though often a lot of time it's not in a comfortable position, but we're still going to do it.
Yeah, Lizzie, what about you?
I always think of these type of questions and try to look at them from the perspective of a long distance. And I think there's real reason to be hopeful. There is a certain invisibility, and there are reasons for it, some of which we own as a community. Some of that responsibility is on us. But I think there is reason to be hopeful, because, as you look at media, Tram, when we were growing up, who represented us on television? It was
Bruce Lee.
Bruce Lee, Connie Chung.
Yes.
The television show MASH, there wasn't a lot. Now you see so much more representation, so much more interest. You see that in media, you see that in politics, you see that in business. And so there is a real reason to be hopeful that we are less invisible now. I admit, right now, we're going through a bit of a U-turn, but I do believe that the arc of humanity is bending, towards justice.
The next question, and Lizzie, I'm going to stay with you on this because you had mentioned it. How do you feel about the narrative and response that's come from law enforcement around the Asian hate crimes happening around the country? And what would you like to see done differently?
Hate crimes are always a really challenging topic. And I think we're at a time where law enforcement And by law enforcement, I mean including the prosecutorial world as well as as our men and women on the front lines of law enforcement. I think they're all really challenging themselves to examine, you know, what is a hate crime, and have we set a standard so high that frankly nothing can be, barely anything can be a hate crime. And you're starting to see that introspection right now. Even, I believe in the last 24 hours, we've had some really, really big news from the Department of Justice in some recent cases in other parts of the country. So I think this is a very interesting time because for many communities, we felt like the ability to qualify as a hate crime was so high, the foundations of proof was so high that it was almost impossible.
Mm-hmm. And I think too that, you know, again, it's that silent minority stigma that we have. And in light of these hate crimes, you see our communities in different cities really taking a stand. Her name slips me, but she's on Grey's Anatomy, the Asian actress. Yes, Sandra Oh, you know, her being out there with her big megaphone and, you know, denouncing all of this hate, and just, you know, people that you see who are really taking a stand. And I think that has really been somewhat the silver lining in all of this, is that coming from a community that doesn't really, you know, our voice is not loud enough, that something like this has pushed our voice to be heard. Jason, what do you think? What do you think about the response and the narrative, and what would you like to see?
In regard to law enforcement, that's actually, because my family, my dad and my brother both was in the police force, and I talked to with all this incident happened, and I heard different perspectives. Some are really feel like the law enforcement is not doing enough to kind of prevent this kind of things happen. But then there's some is really don't want to have any police to be involved, and they have told me that, you know, having more police present in their business to protect their safety is actually hurting their business, and they would prefer that, you know, to leave the police out of it. And there's, you know, obviously there are some looking at differently. Is, you know, I would like to be safe when I go into a certain place, and I know that there's a officer be there, so that, you know, any things hate crime against me, I will feel that I can actually have my family to be there with me. I think, you know, as far as this question, just like Lizzie said, it's very touchy too when it comes to hate crime and law enforcement. There's definitely different perspectives. I hear both.
Tram, I'm going to just go ahead and jump in here.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My dog's
problem.
barking. I'm going to apologize on the front end.
It's part of the joy of working remotely and Zoom calls, right?
If it's not kids, it's dogs. Okay, yes. Yeah.
I would say I agree with Jason and Lizzie completely. I think we're seeing a turn in where the justice system is starting to recognize hate crimes more and more. Historically, that hasn't really been the reality. I think one thing is what I've, you know, things like I mentioned the Maple Grove case up here recently with the young kids, that they were told, the kid was told, or the parents were told, well, your kid should have just got one of the managers and dress it. Not when he's being choked and slapped and thrown on the trampoline. You know, what's the role of the staff rounding around the place is jump in there, right? And so I think that's part of not only the legal and justice system, not only the police officers, every single one of us. How do we step in? I want to, Jason, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, but Jason touched on it. I wanted to come back to this, is the whole model minority myth, right? And that feeds into this, whether or not we believe that these hate crimes are happening either. Because the model minority myth was created back in the, if my history serves me right, back in the 60s, right? As a way to say Black and brown or Black and Latino folks, well, look at the Asian folks there. If you just do what they do, you will be fine. You will exceed. You will be whatever, fill in the blank. And it was created to further divide. And so it has certainly achieved what it was created for, right? And so I think we need to, as a community, really break down that whole model minority. That's not us.
Excellent point. Jennifer, what do you think?
I think, well, there's an approach that I've used in the past, and I've seen that is successful in terms of like when a perpetrator is causing harm to a victim. I don't know if you've heard of restorative justice. So that's something that I've used when I was working in a school setting. So restorative justice approach is like a response to a crime to organize a meeting between the victim and the offender, sometimes with representatives in the wider community being involved. So I'm just thinking of like, if a situation like that ever happened to me, I would rather, instead of having the perpetrator being criminalized, I want to have that restorative justice process. Because in my school setting, when we did this process, we didn't want to suspend our students. We want to go like, say if there was 2 kids fighting, okay, let's have these two, the person that was being harmed and the perpetrator, let's have them to come together and discuss the situation. So it's more of like understanding why you're doing this and learning from each other in a way. I know it sounds kind of touchy, because like if you're the victim, like would you want to go through that? But I'm just thinking, like, I've seen this happen where when you talk things through, I see the value in that, in the restorative justice process, versus just suspending the person and having the 2 students come back together without any acknowledgement of the situation and how do you heal from that, or even, apologize or even do stuff like that. Because when I'm going to say that my goddaughter got bullied, and she said that, when they didn't put them together on why she's being bullied and stuff like that, they just suspended that person right away. And then when they brought them together, that person was really pissed off at my goddaughter. And to me, I'm like, why can't there be like a restorative justice process to have the understanding is like, why are you, because she has no clue why she's being bullied. And why is that person doing the harm? So I think that's one thing that I would recommend, or I would like to see happen in some instances. And I know one of the Oakland elderly that got that was being harassed. There was a video about this. Instead of him pressing charges, he went through a restorative justice process, and I thought that was great. Like to me, I was like, that would be a good way, instead of just criminalizing the person. Let's learn and see how can we heal from that situation.
Yeah, so true. It's so important to have that dialogue. You got to understand the why before you move on to a solution. That's part of the solution, right? All right. So right now, as we start our final section on solutions and advocacy, I would love for each of you to begin to think about what you can do to make a difference in the next 2 weeks. Towards the end of this section, we will be providing you with a link to also share your first move towards advocacy. So as you think about that, I want to go back to our panelists and talk about solutions, advocacy, and allyship. And the first question is, what do AAPI community organizations need now in order to feel empowered to amplify their work in promoting and protecting their AAPI communities? Lizzie, what do you think?
Well, I'm going to be very practical here as someone who's worked in politics a long time. They need money. There are some really wonderful organizations that, there's some really wonderful local and national organizations that could use the power of a check to create an institution of advocacy. Tram, are you there? There we go.
You know what?
Tram, you froze for a little bit.
Yes.
You know what? And Lizzie froze too. And I was waiting for, this technology. It really gets the best of us, doesn't it? I apologize. It totally froze and I was waiting for it to unfreeze. So unfortunately, I missed that part of what Lizzie was saying. But
Tram, I can sum it all up. One thing that we can all do is support these organizations with the power of a check.
Okay. Jason, what do you think? What is it that we can do to feel empowered and amplify our work?
I agree with Lizzie. Donate to those organizations, but I would also add, if each one of us can start commit time to volunteer, because volunteer is very powerful and the work can be done, and we need money, we need the people. And as a community person myself, running an organization, through this whole what is happening this past year, I feel like my organization, myself included, need to really work closely with other Asian American communities so that we can. I spoke to Jennifer yesterday on the side, and we talked about that. It's very important that the communication is very important. I see a lot of great work has been done in regard to the Stop Asian Hate, but then we not always working, in the coordination together. We probably should.
I love that, volunteering, getting active in the community. Jennifer, what do you think? How can we move forward to amplify our work?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Lizzie, our organizations or national and local need that financial support in order to do our work. And especially with COVID, a lot of nonprofits are hurting. But, I think one thing that people can do in terms of supporting our community is taking the bystander training from Hollaback Asian American Advancing Justice is supporting this training. I think there'll be a link to do these trainings, but I recently went through it, and it just teaches you if a situation happens, what are the steps in order to help support someone that's being harmed. Or de-escalation is another training. There's 4 different types of training, but it's overarching is a bystander training. So I think stuff like that you could do. It's a 1-hour training. You'll learn a lot. And I think, in my organization, I do want to start doing the unpacking your biases training. I know there's a few folks that were questioning on how to get involved with that workshop. Currently I've only scheduled it for our youth. But I feel like I said, I'm why is it just our youth? I feel like anybody of all ages, all ethnicities should go through this training. So I think that's something that I will do in the near future, because it's important. And just talking about it with this panel, I'm we should do this to a greater audience, not just our youth. So that's something that I need to, do in the near future.
Yeah, and I think I saw in the chat that Brent offered the link to that training, right, Brent?
Yeah.
Or more information about it.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it's all in there now, and everything will also be, everybody, on our website, on our YouTube channel once we do final production, and we will be putting this out along with all of our other videos since April of 2020 on those spots as well.
Okay, perfect. Okay, Laura, we did not forget about you.
Don't worry. I think Jennifer, great that you brought up bystander allyship, because part of allyship is not only using your voice, right, to step in, but lifting the voices of others. And so I think doing something like what we're doing right here, and when you have the power to do something like what we're doing right here, invite other voices in so they are heard, right? So at Mayo Clinic, we host every Friday these, what we call Everybody in Conversations, hour long for the last year and a couple months. And 500 plus people jump on our calls every Friday. And so when the shootings in Georgia happened, we quickly pivoted and invited the, Center for Asian American Leadership up here in Minnesota to be on. We invited the Asian Health Equity Institute from Chicago to be on, and talk about both from a societal and community impact, but also from the health and both physical and mental impact that hate crimes have, right? Both short-term, long-term, and what that looks like. And then giving people tools and resources, the 500 plus listeners, tools and resources for them to take back and apply to their work. So I think using your voice, but not only just using your voice, is using your platforms to raise the voices of others.
Wow, Laura, I love that. What a great, great dialogue and resource and tool to have within a company. It makes me think I wish more companies would do that. It's so simple, but it's so effective.
Yeah, it is. And we've reached over 500 every single Friday. And we have, what our vision really is, how do we build the 70,000 inclusionists inside of Mayo Clinic so that we can go and impact our work outside. So.
Oh, wow. Maybe that's kind of a takeaway, that we go back maybe to our companies and, perhaps maybe we can do something like that with our own organization. I know personally at Channel 12, we just went through 3 inclusive training seminars, if you will, that were, some of them were an hour and a half, others were 2 hours. And we just talked about, how do we relay information to our viewers? Who are we talking to? What's our demo? How does our language shape perception and what we should and what we shouldn't be doing? But that, that happened obviously in light of everything that's happening. But I love the daily dialogue that you guys are doing within Mayo Clinic. That really is helpful because it just keeps the conversation going on a regular basis. And also too, I think companies have to think about, investing the time for their employees to do this. So many times these companies, and I know we're guilty of it too, but we're rush, day turn, and it's like, producers are trying to produce while they're listening onto this seminar. And it's just like, whoa, pump the brakes. This is crucial, valuable time that you got to give your employees time to really absorb it. So I love that. I absolutely love that. Okay, second question on solutions, advocacy, and allyship. What one thing can individuals, leaders, and work colleagues do as allies to support their AAPI peers and take a stand against anti-Asian racism? Since we're on Laura, what do you think? What's the one thing?
Gosh, I don't know if there's a one thing, but I think believe them. Believe them, right? And create an environment where they can bring, because just like we talk about the George Floyd killing, our Black colleagues are bringing those sentiments that are happening in the community with them. And so when we talk about the AAPI hate crimes, the impact that has, Lizzie, you talked about turning on the news and seeing the women that look like me, right? That could have been me. And that impact it has when I come into that workspace, and I may not be my 100% today because of the external impact. I may not be thinking straight. I probably should not even be here, right? And so, my team, I've told the team that I work with at Mayo, when I see things that they're off, I'm like, take the second half of the day off. I want you to stay off of email, so be that proactive ally for them.
Oh, I love that too. I love that. When you see some warning signs, take a moment for yourself. And that will be so important in just your whole well-being. Yeah, that's great. Lizzie, what about you? What do you think? The one thing that we can do to support each other?
Sure, I'm going to do the same thing that Laura did and expand it beyond one thing. But there's some things that are so easy and so simple. You know, I tell people all the time, support an Asian-owned business. They were disproportionately damaged during this last year. So go out to an Asian-owned restaurant, or go out to Lily's or Asiana for your groceries. You know, it's just fun anyways. Second, educate yourself about the history of Asian Americans here in Arizona. You know, did you know that Chinese Americans have been here in the Valley since the early 1900s? And there was a vibrant Chinese Chinatown where the Diamondbacks, you know, baseball stadium sits now. You know, did you know that historically that Japanese Americans who lived in Phoenix were interned behind barbed wire during World War II if they lived west of Grand Avenue, but not east of Grand Avenue? And during the time, do you know that the one local grocer who refused to shun Japanese Americans at the time was the Basha family? These are all the stories of our history that are right here in our backyard. And then third, be a good ally. If you see something, speak up. You know, we all have some privilege. Let's use the power of our privilege for good.
Oh, I love all of that. Yes. And you know, you see, after what has happened with the whole BLM movement, you've seen such a huge backing of Black-owned businesses. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Asian grocery stores, which we all love and shop at, I mean, you know, that is an experience in and of itself. But yes, absolutely. You forget about the businesses, you know, the simple things that you can do. Okay, Jennifer, what do you think? There's probably more than just one thing, but
I think for me, I think if there's a way to advocate for K through 12 Asian American studies, like contacting our local, you know, school district, or even legislation. I know Chicago just like a week ago enacted a law to making sure that, you know, K to 12 has Asian American studies in their curriculum. So I don't know. That's something that I would like to see here in Arizona, or even, you know, nationwide. But that's one thing that I would be passionate about, if there's a way we could all come together on that, because I feel like our identity crisis, like what I went through, I don't want that to happen to my child. Like, she's 1 year old. But another thing I want to, like with Lizzie, like my partner owns a donut shop, and like we were really struggling when the pandemic happened. So I think, you know, supporting any API businesses, go make it a takeout Thursday, Friday, or do something like regularly that you could help support, you know, businesses, because they have been greatly impacted. We barely survived, but we're surviving. But stuff like that, I think that helps our community as well.
Jason, what do you think?
Donut Parlor have a very good donut. You have to go if you haven't been there. You know, there's so many things to do, and I think that I was just thinking that if you can support the business, like Lizzie said, that will be, you know, one easy thing to do. Go shopping, go to get involved with the community, join a group. If you are in a corporation, many corporations have employee resource group that you learn about the Asian American culture, work with your Asian American colleague to those projects. If you are not, then join community group. There's many of them here in Arizona. If you are in college, and especially at ASU and U of A does too, they have Asian American study. Sign up a semester or couple classes to learn about the history aspect of it. And I think that next month in May is the Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Attend festival if there is any open festival. If not, I'm sure there's a bunch of different virtual events. Just be part of it, and those little things will help. And as I keep mentioning about closing the gap, that's the way to do it.
Mm-hmm. All right.
And cut the check. It's just like Lizzie said, cut the check.
Yeah, exactly. Support in so many ways, especially financially. Okay, so now we are near the end, but we want to create a word cloud. So we want our attendees to think about this. What is the one thing that you will do in the next 2 weeks to advocate for the AAPI and other marginalized communities? And while our attendees are giving their word clouds, I wanted to get a final thought from each and every one of you. The final takeaway. Jason, we'll start with you.
I think that coming through something that is so horribly experience with seeing all these things are happening around the country, there's a good thing to come out of it is also know that there is we have a strong community that is also supporting our effort. And I think that this is not a battle alone for Asian American. It is a battle for all of us who have to face discrimination every day. And I think that I think the continued dialogue, continue outreach, and continue to educate yourself will really can make a difference. And thanks again for DLA for having me be part of the panel today.
We thank you. Lizzie, what's your final thought?
Well, I was just looking at the number of attendees, and it's 200 plus attendees. So thank you all for attending this. Your presence, your interest, your time is a real gift. And this feels like progress. So I guess my closing statement is, since we're all here in the Valley, if you find yourself at the Henry restaurant, I'm there every day because our office is right above it. So if you see me there, please tell me you were at this talk. I'd love to get to know you.
Oh, that's so great. I want to stop by and have a drink with you, Lizzie. We could talk forever. Yeah.
I have access to coffee and to adult drinks as well.
I bet you do.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to just jump in. Everyone, just so you know, we put a link in there for the menti.com for you to sign in there and click on that link in the chat, everybody, so that we can make sure to capture everybody's thoughts as we do the final thoughts of all of our panelists. I'll put it in one more time. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brent. Floor, what is your final thought?
So I look forward to the day when I can come back down there and visit and catch up with all of you. But until then, this will do. I think I've said it before, and I'll say it again, is use your voice to lift up others. I think that's the biggest piece. And the other piece I just want to leave any comment on is, I've told my team this, and people at Mayo, people who are joining from Mayo, you probably heard me say this before too, is in the last year, it feels like it's one step forward, two steps back. But in that, even though it feels that way, for me, what keeps me going in this work for the last 20 years is that each time I take those 2 steps back, I feel like the next step I take forward, I bring more people along. And so that's what keeps me going in this work. And I truly see, especially in the last year, this building of coalitions and allyship across races, across economic, across you name it, that people are coming together to really step into this work. So I encourage all of us to keep doing that work.
All right. And before we get to Jennifer, I just want to remind our attendees, again, the word cloud question. What one thing will you do in the next 2 weeks to advocate for the AAPI and other marginalized communities? And Brent offered the link. So again, please weigh in. And finally, Jennifer, we're going to end it with you. What is your final thought?
I would say, this past couple months just really makes me think of the word unity. If there's a way for us to, come together, multiracial cultural coalition building is key to my work. So I want to highlight, what Laura said earlier, So we're fiscally sponsored, AZAA and HPI for Equity. We're a coalition of 9 API organizations statewide in Arizona, but One Arizona, which is a coalition of 28, 28 organization, people of color, predominantly Latinx, but there's Indigenous and Black nonprofits in this coalition. So I had like the honor to be able to work with 28 amazing coalition members. And, you know, me being able to work with just all these different organizations, and they reached out to me, you know, when the Atlanta shootings happened, like they were the first ones, like the Black and Brown community reached out to me and said, are you okay? What can we do to support? And stuff like that. It brings me hope that we could all, you know, work together to combat any of these issues that are impacting our community, especially with discrimination. So I'm hoping that we could all unite and be kind to one another. Like that's my hope for everything that we do.
Mm-hmm. I think just in being a part of this organization and this discussion and great dialogue, my final takeaway, just not just hearing what you guys are saying, but just, you know, from the heart here is definitely educate yourself. I mean, we're talking from young to old. When Lizzie was talking about the history of Asians here in the Valley in Phoenix, Arizona, that just gave me chills. I mean, you know, that I did not know that. And it was just, it's fascinating. And kudos to the Bashes family too. I mean, really, our local grocer. Also, you know, the need to support local Asian businesses. Shameless plug, but my husband and I own a coffee shop here in the Valley. And, you know, but just local in general, but obviously, you know, in light of everything that's been happening, it would be great to support the Asian businesses as well. Let's not forget about them. And also, I think the most important thing is just to speak up. Again, it goes back to, you know, being kind of the silent, the community that just doesn't complain, works hard, works even harder when pushed, and, you know, doesn't want to rock the boat or ruffle the feathers. And I think it's important, you know, to have our voices heard. And if we see something, then we need to say something. So we just want to thank you so much for all of your insight. Brent, do we have that word cloud available and to see what our attendees said?
I don't know. Let's see. We had a little, you know, we had some fun with it. There we go. There is one. All right. Let me share my screen here, everybody. And I just want to thank everybody for all of your questions today. We're going to do our best to get through them as we finish up this segment here. And if we don't worry, our panelists will be still answering them for us, and we'll provide those on our website. So here we go, Tram.
Okay, drum roll.
Everybody
Wow.
see that?
Yes, look at that. These are always so enlightening. Definitely advocate, support, listen, learn, be supportive, speak up, support local, connect, research, donate. Those are some of the big ones. Reflect. Allyship. Be supportive. These are all great.
There's also lots of smaller ones that are the same thing about supporting AAPI businesses.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll add to that a little bit. Is pay in cash or with Venmo or some other way so that they don't have the credit card fees. I was asked yesterday to do that when I was somewhere, and because especially with right now with the pandemic, because the credit card companies are not doing anything for small businesses in general, but this happened to be an Asian-owned, Vietnamese-owned business. So definitely, you know, think about that. And I was happy to do that. It was very easy. So my little two cents.
That's so true. No, that's an excellent point. You don't realize the credit card fees that they tack on to all these businesses. I'm trying to read the fine print. Maybe this is when I need to get glasses, but.
So Tram, I'll help you out a little bit because my screen's a little larger.
Yeah.
We have Mentor Younger AAPI, connecting, speaking up, become more knowledgeable, right? So that's always good to do a little bit of research, right? We are responsible for doing research. And finding things out before we go to our colleagues and friends, right? To ask about something, right? Do a little research first. Learn about AAPI in Arizona. Let's see. Speak up. Someone's going to continue to speak up, which is great. So we really thank everybody. We will make a capture of this, everybody. Don't worry, include it. And so Tram, I'm going to pass it back to you as we finish up.
Yeah, that word cloud was so wonderful to see. I just want to thank everyone involved in this whole entire project and organization, especially our wonderful, wonderful panelists, Jason Wong, Lizzie Kim, Laura Lee, Jennifer Chow. I think we can move on from this discussion better and more enlightened and more empowered. You guys were all phenomenal and just brought so much to the plate, so much to the table. So we so appreciate your time in this. I also want to thank DLA, obviously, as an organization. You guys have given this platform to have this great discussion. So without you, we are just so grateful for this platform too, to have this conversation. And I'm going to toss it back to Joanna Deshay, Executive Director of DLA. And Joanna, thank you so much for all of this.
Thank you so much, Tram. We love you. We love you. We love you.
We love you.
We love you for the continuous support that you give us as an organization, but even more than that, for the leadership and advocacy that you do every day by being on the news. Lizzie said it before. I think when young girls turn on the TV and they see a Tram Mai, for them, it's all very possible. And I think that is the brilliance of what you do and the seat that you sit in. And just please know that we see you, we honor you, and we honor all of you for your narrative today and for your perspective. This was a conversation that was long overdue. So Laura, I'm so pleased that you all were having those conversations. And for everyone on the call today, have those conversations at your dinner tables, when you're having coffee, when you're at work, when you although it may be a little awkward at times, we need to have these conversations, because these conversations are how we get closer, how we move the needle forward, and how we really shift the pendulum more towards the side of justice. So that is going to be very important for all of us. So what I'd love to do now is I would love to bring on a few attendees that had some questions, but I'll ask my one questions to the panel if I could, because I saw it again in our Q&A area, which is around the idea of how do we explain and talk about this sort of violence that's happening in the AAPI community with our children. We talked about this, I mentioned with the panelists, how difficult it is for me, especially after George Floyd. I have teenage boys, and I was mentioning to the panel how difficult my conversations are around driving and being stopped and what to do then. It's a conversation I never thought I would have to have, right, with my teenage son. I would thought it would be just, hey, don't turn that music too loud, try not to speed. The normal, and for me, it's hands on the steering wheel, don't get out of the vehicle. So how do we talk to our children about what's happening, the violence that they're seeing? Because I know for them, the violence is happening to people that look like them. So what do we say? Lizzie, any perspective to lend to how do we talk to our children about this violence?
Gosh, that is such a hard thing, because on the one hand, you don't want your children to live, you don't want them to be scarred and carry that scar with them. On the other hand, this is the reality they live in. It's hopefully not the reality they're going to live in forever, but it is the reality right now. And I guess the best way we can talk about this is to say what the reality is and talk about it in the context that there are people out there who are so traumatized and so fearful in their own lives that they are taking it out on the most vulnerable who look like us right now. That seems to be the reality.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any other panels want to answer that? I've got a few other questions I'd like to tee up, but any other panels want to add to how do we have the conversation with our kids?
I have a 13 years old, so I spoke to her about this, and she asked why they just target somebody look like us, and I said to her that I say those people they act violently toward Asian because they're scared. They're scared. That's the first reaction is to attack and to hurt someone because they doesn't know about us and they don't know how to deal with us. And I also let her know that just because there is some small number of minority acting like that doesn't mean that everybody is like that. What you need to do is to understand that those people act out of fear. Of course, you got to be careful too. If you start sensing that, you got to have to watch out yourself. I have a friend that in San Francisco, she shared that with me that her kid was in the car driving, and then suddenly her daughter said, Mom, I'm so glad that we have to put masks on because they cannot see that we're Asian.
Oh, that breaks
so
my
that was kind of sad. That was when
Yes.
I hear something like that, it's horrible.
Yes, it really is. And that is the one thing that I think for me is so disheartening. You asked that question earlier, Tram, about how you're feeling. I think my feelings kind of ebb and flow, right? I get disheartened, then I get sad, then I get angry, then the racial battle fatigue sets in, and then you're like, I just want to go watch, binge watch something, there's kind of the whole range of emotions, right? Just to kind of detach from it all. And so what I'd like to do is I want to make sure we get through some of these questions. So if we have Kirsten, I hope I'm saying that correctly, Kirsten Anderson with us. Kirsten, would love to bring you on for you to ask your questions to our panel. Kirsten?
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, you think you can hear me. You pronounced my name correctly, Joanna. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And first, I just wanted to thank DLA for this event. It's been very helpful and very timely, so thank you. And two shameless plugs. One, I put a link in the chat for the City of Phoenix Planning and Development Ethnic Heritage Map. They did one in the AAPI, so that's in there.
Wonderful.
Oh, good.
Feels that they've been discriminated against based on national origin in the areas of housing, public accommodation, or employment, please contact the Phoenix Equal Opportunity Department. Okay, now to my question. I have an Asian American friend in the Bay Area, and I was talking to her about the recent events, and she said that there are volunteers in that area that walk with their AAPI elderly to help keep them safe. And I was wondering if there are any things like that here in the Phoenix area.
So Jennifer, any local kind of volunteering activities such as walking, because I would be so down. My kids and I would have a blast doing that. So are there any volunteer efforts that people can align with?
We are having conversations about this, actually. Someone, one of our coalition members, Asian Chamber, brought this up. They hosted a unity march and a vigil recently, but we heard about what Oakland and San Francisco was doing. So we were thinking if this is something that we could emulate something out here in Phoenix. So it's a conversation we're having. It's just a matter of like implementing it. So we'll see. We could try to have that conversation again and see that the need. How do we even get that going?
Well, please know that Diversity Leadership Alliance is right there with you. So if you would like to figure out, maybe this is one of those joint kind of partnership things we can all do together. Because I think, Lizzie, I touched on this for many of you that know, we talk about the attacks on the elderly community, and that one fall is all it takes. And I think I mentioned and shared with the panel, my mom fell and broke her hip at 78, and it's not something, and subsequently lost her life because of it. So these falls are not, we're not talking about, we're not just talking about, and it's such a cowardly act to begin with, but this is something where we have to hold our elders in high regard and we have to protect them at all costs. So definitely know that DLA is right there with you. I would like to move and bring Patrick Miller on, Brent, if we could. Patrick, good morning. How are you?
I'm great.
Excellent. So Patrick, I would love for you to please ask your question and to the panel. And so yes, if you're ready, we're ready for you.
Okay. I mean, what I was sort of asked to say by Brent is in regards to being a better witness. The reality is, if you see something happening, if you don't have the physical ability or the training to intervene, then the best you can do is emotionally detach and look at everything, document everything, memorize everything. The more detail you can provide, the better. The better chance of getting a conviction if someone's arrested, the better, just a better chance of getting justice for whatever happened.
That is so powerful, Patrick, because that is what in the case we just saw, right? The young lady with the video camera on with the continuous, in the George Floyd case, we see a lot of people point to that, right? The continuous video where there's no interruption, and we could really kind of see a timeline, I think was beneficial. And so for all of you, how, Laura, do you feel to what Patrick is talking about? How can we be better kind of allies? That's a trend, the theme I'm seeing in the question. How can we be better allies, better advocates? How can we be better witnesses, right? And just in terms of documenting. So your perspective on that, Laura.
Sorry, hold on. I had 3 screens. My mouse was somewhere on each of the 3 screens.
That's okay.
I think when it comes to allyship, and I talked about this earlier, but it's when you believe that that person experienced it, right? Do not invalidate, because when you say, "Oh, but Joanna didn't really mean it,"
right?
Or I know Jason, and that would never come off like that. Would never say that. Invalidates my experience. That invalidates my experience and what I'm feeling about whatever situation it is, whether it's discrimination, harassment, or even just as an employment situation, just my experience as an employee, right? And so you've got to believe it, do not invalidate it, and then work with that person to identify what are the next steps going forward. How do we work together to address the issue? And how can I lift your voice, Joanna, so that you are heard beyond this? And so that's part of it. From an employer perspective, though, I think part of it is along with what Patrick was saying about document, being able to dig into your data and understand whether or what's happening within your employee populations, right? And some of the things we're seeing is, and if the case may be for some other organizations that are hearing too, is, if you're seeing an increase in your minority populations, but have you dug in deeper to see the fact that maybe certain populations, Asians maybe, is leaving your organization? Right. So why is that, right? And so I think from an employer perspective, the documentation part comes in digging into your data to better understand what that looks like.
Wonderful. Patrick, thank you so much for your perspective. Yes, Lizzie, please.
I wonder if you give me a moment for this, because,
Yes.
I actually did take the download and looked and reviewed some of this bystander allyship training. And I had an interesting experience that I think so many women who watch that will have. And it is that it really talks about, again, as Patrick said, in a setting where something seems wrong, but it is not unsafe, where you do not feel unsafe.
Yes.
The way to intervene is very subtle. It's to intervene, to start talking to people, to de-escalate, to get people away from each other. I thought, gosh, these are all the same tools that every woman has been taught to help take care of our sisters when we see this out there, when we see another woman where you can tell something potentially bad could happen. We all are kind of trained to take care of each other. It's the same type of training, but to someone who, looks different.
Right. That amplification is so important, Lizzie. And I just think, I am notorious for stepping in and saying something. And I usually smile, which they're like, oh my God, why is she smiling? Because, because it's one of those where and I simply sometimes will say the following, that's not okay. And I leave it just as that. Whatever the comment is, whatever the aggression or microaggression, I just simply say, that is not okay. And I'm not okay with it. And they always go, well, I'm not talking to you. I'm like, well, you're actually talking to all of us. First, you're in a public place, one, and so I think once people recognize that that is absolutely not okay, that behavior will not be tolerated, accepted, overlooked, I think then it gives other people permission, right, to be a little braver and to stand and support you. And so that I just really think is something that's very important for us all to do always, for anyone you see that's being mistreated, because, I love, that's why we use the Martin Luther King Jr. quote, which is the idea that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that's why we have to kind of stand strong. I want to bring Chantel West in, who is on our education committee and has been really instrumental in helping plan a lot of these. Chantel, good morning to you. And I would love for you to ask the panelists your question, please, in that lovely yellow, looking very springy.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everybody. First of all, panelists, thank you so much. And this was an awesome, awesome talk. As being an attendee not on this webinar, but even with previous conferences that DLA has put on, one of the biggest themes that I really enjoy was dispelling the myth or debunking the myth. So I know some of you guys have already talked about it a little bit, especially I know Jennifer had kind of touched a little bit on it too. With Jennifer, I love your vibe. Just want to let you know that. Can you just since we have everybody's attention here, and I know some is probably taking notes and want to share this amongst with their groups in their firms as well. What are some of the myths right now that you want to debunk? Just like, that's not true. That's not who we are. That's not what we're about.
There's a lot.
I know, right?
Well, not all of us are good in math and science. Not all of us are good in math and science, and not every one of us work for an engineering firm.
Keep it going.
I mean, continue. Well, I'm sure they can start.
Not all great at golf.
But
yes, or like it, right? That's like.
I think one of the big thing is culturally we are not taught to be vocal. So when you see your colleague at work or in places that doesn't speak up, often being looked at as we don't have our opinion. I talked about that, I talk it from my perspective, I have seen, like Asian American have tendency, we want it to be perfect. So we really not going to say anything unless we know it's 100% or maybe 120% correct. So then we kind of hold back our opinion. And this is not the culture that we are here in America. Is pretty much just say whatever you want. Sometimes don't even need to do a fact check. I mean, we see politicians do that, right? So just so you know, if you met an Asian American, then we maybe not always speaking up, have raise our hand, be the first one. That does not mean that we doesn't have our opinion.
Thank you.
One that I always I'm surprised by, Chantal. It's such a great question. Is people don't realize that we are very patriotic. There is this strange assumption that somehow we are going to be more loyal to the country of our ethnic heritage than this country, and that's just not true.
That is such a good point. Lizzie, that's the one thing about my mom. If you ever met my mom, she was so patriotic. I mean, she was an immigrant, but was so proud of, bringing all of us here and that we now were naturalized citizens and could fly our flag. Every election, she had a picture of the Obamas. You would think that they were relatives because they were up on her, they were up on her mantle next to pictures of us. And people were like, "Are those the Obamas?" And she's like, "Yes," and it was so, there was so much pride. And I agree with you that there's always this misconception that somehow immigrants, will still have alignment. We have, we still honor our past, we still honor our cultural backgrounds, but are very much so proud to be Americans. So that's such a wonderful point. Chantel, thank you so much for your question. And last but not least, I would love to bring Marion Kelly on. I know he was having some mic issues, so I would love for Marion just to, if we can bring him on. Let's see if he's still with us. I think and he's not sure if his mic is going to work. So I'll say, Marion, if you're okay with it, I'll say what you were going to say, which is that we are so proud of our co-founder, Christine French, the late Christine French, who is up in heaven with my mom and several other ladies probably chatting it up about the work that we're doing down here. So Christine, we see you, we honor you, and we thank you for leading this effort and for mentoring so many of us, including myself. So those are, I'll wrap that up, and I just want to do some quick closing before we move on, which is just to thank our volunteers, to thank our sponsors, to thank our board of directors that really guide the strategic effort of the organization. And again, a thank you to our fearless board members that you see there, and a special welcome to new board members, Kate Morris, who is the GM over at KPNX Channel 12, and Tandra Richardson, who is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at University of Phoenix. So they are joining the DLA board. And I just want to ensure that I also say a special thank you to Dr. Mallory Titel, who is over our education committee. She serves as the chair of the education committee, and of course, Brent Scholar, Dr. Scholar, that you see popping in and also hear popping in asking the questions. We are really grateful for your continued support and could not do any of this work without you. And speaking of not being able to do the work that we do, a special thank you to our sponsors. We are so grateful to Tegna Foundation Channel 12 for awarding us with a 2021 programming grant. And a special thank you again to DLA board member and general manager Kate Morris, to Carrie Watts, who is so helpful in getting everything kind of where it needs to be. And again, a special thank you again to the amazing Tram Mai for moderating today's session. We also want to say a thank you to Mr. Marion Kelly and Mayo Clinic and Mr. Laura Lee. We were recipients of the Everybody in Fund for Change grant, which supports this dialogue series. And lastly, I just want to thank my friend, my sister in the community, Ms. Kim Covington of Arizona Community Foundation. We were recipients of the Black Philanthropy Initiatives Grant, which further continues this dialogue that we are hosting in 2021. Again, we could not do any of this work without them, and please know how grateful and humbled we are at the continued support. Now I would love to just bring Brent in to just talk a little bit about the next summer series that we have coming up in June, July, and August. Brent?
Yes, thank you, Joanna. And again, a very, very heartfelt thank you to all of our panelists today, and especially Tram for joining us at such a quick turnaround. You were with us last month in March, and if you haven't seen them, please go to our website, our YouTube page. Please watch all of our past stuff. They are fantastic, which means what's next, right? We're taking a break.
We are.
Folks, DLA is a little tired. We're taking the month of May off, ruminate, think about things. We're going to be providing a bunch of links that Jennifer has been providing us throughout, gratefully, and everyone else for you to be doing over May. So don't worry, and just think about what's happening and what can you do to change the system. That's what I'm going to ask you to do over May, but then come back in June. In June through August, we're going to be looking at the LGBTQIA+ community. We're going to look at neurodiversity in the workplace and also food insecurities. So we have a lot of stuff going on. Please check our DLA website. Please join us on Facebook. We're there, and we always post these up there in Facebook when we have our pre-registration. And we're Instagram, LinkedIn. Join us, follow us. Please, please, please. And we do have our wonderful, wonderful sponsors. But if you've enjoyed today's workshop and are content with this information, as I've seen many of you say you are in the chat today, think about donating $20 today to celebrate DLA's 20th anniversary. Yeah, that's right, folks. Christine French, Marion Kelly, and we also have Bob Enderly, who's also up there with Christine, smiling down with all of us, who started this organization 20 years ago. Please help celebrate with us to continue to keep these vital dialogues going, and also to keep these workshops, complimentary to all of you today. All 150 of you who joined us today. Actually, we were up at 170 at one point, so thank you. So in the chat area, there is a link, of course, for you. If you'd like to make a donation to DLA, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and all of your donations may be tax deductible depending on your tax position and consulting with your advisor. And with that, thank you everybody for joining us. And Joanna, for final word.
Thank you so much to all of our attendees for your time and attention today. We do not for one instance take your time for granted. We all know it's the one commodity we do not have enough of. So we are grateful that you chose to spend that time with us today. A special thank you again to panel members Lizzie Kim, Laura Lee, Jason Wong, and Jennifer Chow, and to the incomparable and always delightful Tram. I'm coming for coffee. I want that peanut butter in the coffee. So
I got you. I got you, sister.
I love it. Thank you, love. And to all of you, enjoy your day. And most importantly, be good to each other. Okay. Be good to each other, advocate for each other, and we'll see you back here in June. Cheers and have a great day.